Hey guys, so I'm going to show you how to start out your pillowcase. After you have ironed your fabric and cut both pieces to the proper sizes, we need to pin both pieces of fabric together. So this piece right here, this black piece, this is my border fabric, and it is laying the right side up. So the proper side that you want to see at the end is facing upwards. I'm going to get my main fabric. And the main fabric needs to be having the wrong side facing up. So this is the proper side, and this is the wrong side that's kind of faded. So now I'm going to use my fingers and approximately just place my two pieces of fabric together, just kind of like this. And now I need to pin it together. So I've got my pins here, and starting at one end, I'm going to pin my fabrics together on the long side. So I match the 40.5-inch side on my borders with the 40.5-inch side on my main fabric. So I match those together, and I'm going to pin all the way down. So I'm just going to start out like this. I'm going to adjust my camera a little bit so you can kind of see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to use my fingers and make sure that they are lined up perfectly as I move down. You want to make sure that your pins are perpendicular to this edge. So the little colored part, the little ball part of the pin should actually not really touch the fabric itself. It should kind of be sticking up at the top of the fabric. So I'm just going to keep using my fingers and keep adjusting my fabric and pinning it all the way down. You only need a pin about every 2 or 3 inches or so. You don't need a ton of pins. But again, before I put a pin in, I'm going to adjust my fabric and make sure that the edges are lining up properly. And I'm almost to my end here. And I'm going to make sure I have one pin right on the edge. So when I'm done, I should have pins all the way down this long edge. So this is what it looks like on this side of the fabric. And this is what it looks like on this side of the fabric. So I'm going to lay it back down. I'm going to have my border piece, my solid black color facing down. And then we're going to go to the next step. Alright, so we are now on to step 2 of our pillowcase, and we need to roll up our main fabric inside of our border fabric. So I'm going to adjust my camera before I show you what I'm doing. So in the last step, we pinned the two pieces of fabric together. Now we're just going to take our main piece of fabric and we're going to roll it up. So I'm going to start at this end of the main fabric, and I'm just going to roll it up. And I'm going to roll it up until I see the other side of the border fabric. So you want to roll it up, not quite to the end, but just enough to where you can now see this piece of fabric. Now we're going to take the other end, the other long end of our border fabric, and we're going to bring it up to these other ends, and we're going to pin along this line. So I'm going to get my pins. And same thing that I did with the last step of holding the fabric in my fingers as I pin them together. I'm going to hold my fabric together as I place the pins in it. So starting out, what you should have is already these two pieces of fabric pinned together. And now at the end, we're going to pin all 3 pieces of fabric together. or 3 ends of fabric together, I should say. So again, you want your pins to be perpendicular to this long edge. And I'm just going to keep pinning all the way down the long end of my pillowcase. Whenever you're pinning, you want to make sure that you do not get the rolled up part into the pins, because we don't want to sew that, because we're going to sew along this line in our next step. So now is kind of the hot dog image comes to shape. So this is the hot dog in here, and the border piece, this is the bun. So this black part, or my black piece, this is the border, is going to surround all of the border fabric. Excuse me, the border piece is going to surround all of the main fabric. Also, again, the little ball parts of your pins should stick up kind of out of the fabric like that. And whenever we're pinning these 3 layers of fabric together, I am going to put a few more pins in than I did in the last step, just because we're actually going to sew after this step. So we want to make sure that we have enough pins to hold it together properly so we get a straight seam. And I'm going to go until I'm at the very end. So I've got just a little bit more to go. So you should see all 3 layers of fabric on the end. And one last pin. So now, this is what my piece looks like. This is a really long rectangle. I've got pins all along this long edge. And before we sew it, I'm just going to take some scissors and I'm going to clip off any extra little threads that are loose on this edge. So try not to pull any. If you see them, try not to pull them. But ones that are already sticking out, you can go ahead and cut them off. It doesn't need to be perfect, because in the next step, after we sew, you will not see this edge, but you want to make sure you clip any that are super long. We've got just a few more down here. And there we go. So now our fabric is all pinned and we're ready to sew. Alright, so we are almost ready to start sewing, but before we do, we want to make sure that our hot dog has not been pinned into our bun improperly. So I'm going to take one hand and I'm going to run it along the kind of the edge where the pins are, and take the other hand and just kind of feel the roll, feel my little hot dog, and I'm going to make sure that my hot dog has not been pinned up here at the top edge improperly. So, feels good. Now we need to just sew a long edge at 5/8 minute seam. So I'm going to adjust my camera a little bit so you can kind of see a little better. I have placed blue masking tape here at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to sew one straight line, making sure that I backstitch at the beginning and at the end. So I'm going to line up my fabric along with my tape, making sure my threads are pulled back. I'm going to drop my presser foot. I'm going to turn my hand wheel toward me, and I'm going to put my needle into my fabric. So I'm going to go forward a little bit, and then I'm going to backstitch and just continue on a straight seam. I do have a pin magnet sitting here to put the pins in as I take them out. So I'm going to take out the first pin already. I'm going to go ahead and go straight. Now I'm going to backstitch. And I'm going to go forward again. Again, you don't want to sew through a pin. So I'm going to just take my pins out as I go. And even as you are sewing your seam all the way down, you want to still make sure that your roll, your little hot dog, is not into this seam improperly. Sorry, that's my dog bagel. Alright, I'm almost to the end. And I'm gonna make sure I backstitch at the very end here. So I like to stop about there, hit my reverse button, go forward again. So I'm gonna pull this out, and now we have sewn our seam. It's probably a little hard to see because it is all black, but we've got our seam all the way sewn. So the next step is to pull our hot dog out of our bun. So this is what it looks like after I sewed it in the last step. I'm going to take one hand and I'm just going to hold onto kind of the border fabric. I'm going to take the other hand and I'm going to pull onto the main fabric. So here's my main fabric on the end. And I'm going to pull onto the main fabric. And as I do this, I'm going to keep pulling with my left hand. And I'm going to kind of pull the border piece back as I go. So this is kind of like in the middle. So this part has been pulled out. This part is still in the bun. And I'm just going to keep pulling on my main fabric. And there we go. And we're almost done. So now we have pulled the inside piece out of our bun. So we'll unroll it. And now we have our border. So just this black piece on my pillowcase. And we've got our main fabric down below. So now that we have pulled our hot dog out of our bun, we just need to iron our fabric. So this is what it looks like after I pulled my hot dog out of my bun. I'm going to start with the right side of the fabric facing up. So the right side is what I can see. I'm going to adjust my camera a little bit. So we're doing just a really basic ironing, but we do need to make sure that we get a straight seam, straight flat seam here. So I'm going to iron a little bit of my main fabric first, and then I'm going to gently push on my iron, so apply a little pressure, and I'm going to gently push my iron out across the border fabric. So when I do this, this is going to make the seam that we just sewed, it's going to make it nice and flat. So the reason we were starting on this side is because this is the side we're going to see when we're done with our pillowcase. And we want this seam to be nice and pretty. And just continue to iron my main fabric. And then I'm going to pull my fabric down so I can get this side. Again, I'm going to start with this main piece of fabric here and apply a little bit of pressure as I move my iron out across the border. So this seam should be nice and flat. I'm going to finish ironing on this side and then I'm going to turn my fabric over and iron on the other side. Our next step is to fold our pillowcase in half and pin the sides together. So before I do that though, I want to make sure that my border and my main fabric are aligned properly. So the border, let me move it. The border, this black part, lines up perfectly with my main fabric. Okay, so this is perfectly straight. It aligns up properly and it aligns up on both sides. So if you have some of the border that's overhanging, or if you have some of the main fabric that's longer than the border, you'll want to cut that and make sure that you have a nice, straight, even line before you pin it together. So I'm going to fold this and I'm going to put the wrong sides of my main fabric together. So here's the right side, and I'm going to fold it like this. So my right side is the one that I can see. Now I'm going to just pin it. I'm just going to pin it all the way down on both sides. So I am first going to make sure that my border fabric is lined up perfectly on both sides here. So if I turn my fabric this direction, you want the border fabric to match up on this end, or this end, with this end. So I'm going to hold that carefully with my fingers and I'm going to pin it. Careful not to pull your fabric as you pin it, because then when you sew it, it might not sew perfectly straight. So I'm going to pin my border first, because if your border does not line up on each side, whenever we are done sewing it, it's going to look off balance, and you'll definitely be able to notice. So now I'm going to take, and I'm going to continue on to the long side. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with pinning earlier, and I'm going to make sure that the ends of my fabric are matching up together. Again, kind of using my fingers as a guide and putting my pins in all the way down. Again, you want your pins to be perpendicular to this edge right here. So my fabric is going this direction and my pins are going this direction. And I'm going to place a pin every few inches or so. Same way I pinned earlier. And I'm going to pin it just all the way down. So now I have my long side of my pillowcase. It's all pinned, except for, oh, one just almost fell out. And now I'm going to pin this short side. So the short side may not exactly line up perfectly, and that's okay. But now that we have our long side pinned together, I'm just going to kind of pick it up here and I'm just going to shake it a little bit just to kind of get out any wrinkles or folds. And now I'm going to pin it. So one of my edges is a little bit overlapping, or excuse me, a little bit longer than the other, and that's okay. But I'm going to leave that where it is because I pinned correctly on this side. And so now since there's a little overhang, I'm just going to pin it the way it lays. Oh. So now I have the short side pinned as well. And after we're done pinning, we will be ready for the next step. The next step is to sew together the edges where we just pinned together. So you want to start with the long edge and you want to start at the top of the border fabric. So for me, that's this top part of this black piece right here. I'm going to adjust my camera again. And this time I'm going to use a 3/8 of an inch seam. So I have moved my masking tape already at 3/8 of an inch seam. If you do not use 3/8, the remaining steps will not work. So I'm going to take out my first pin. Lower my presser foot, lower my hand needle, and I'm going to just sew a straight seam down, making sure that I backstitch at the beginning and at the end. And backstitch. And straight. And again, make sure you take out your pins as you go. This next part, you want to be really careful because right here where the border fabric and the main fabric come together, there's a lot of layers of fabric right here from that previous seam we did. So you kind of need to not push the fabric through, but make sure that you're guiding it plenty and make sure that you're going at a fast enough of a speed to where the needle can get through those thick layers of fabric. And I'm just going to keep going straight, or forward. Move that little thread there. So as I'm approaching this corner right here, there are two options. You can either pivot your fabric, so you could, once I get about to the 3/8 of an inch from this edge down here, I can either lift up my presser foot and rotate my fabric, or you can just keep doing a long straight edge this way, making sure you backstitch, and then you can start a new edge on the other end, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to backstitch here and then restart a new straight line on the other edge. I usually stop about there and I hold the fabric here when I backstitch. And forward. Now right at the end I backstitch again. And forward. And now I'm just going to move my fabric and I'm going to sew on this short edge, making sure to back stitch again. Oh, let's fix our threads. There we go. Again, on this end of my fabric, one end is a little longer than the other, and that's okay, but that's how we wanted to pin it because that's the way it laid by itself. So lower the presser foot, lower the needle, go forward, backward, keep going forward. And I'm just going to keep going with the straight seam here. I'm going to move my machine, make sure I don't block the camera with the fabric. And we're almost to the end here. I'm going to now backstitch, forward, backstitch that very little end, and forward. So I'm going to pull my threads, and we are done sewing those seams. In our last video, we sewed together our pillowcases, so we've got our short edge sewn together and our long edge sewn together, so now it actually resembles a pillowcase. We did use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, so the thread is right here where my finger is, and then here's the edge of the fabric, obviously. We want to get ready to do a French seam, so we're going to cut off a little bit of this fabric here that's between the thread and between the edge. Adjust the camera. I'm going to start here at the border edge. So as you do this, you want to be very, very careful that you do not cut into the thread, because then you just cut the seam and then you have to resew it. So you want to cut off about 1/4 of an inch. I'm not going to measure it, but I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to put them just right in the middle between the edge and the thread. So I'm taking my scissors and put them right in the middle. And I'm just going to cut. Again, this part right here where the main fabric and the border fabric come together, there's a lot of layers of fabric right here. So whenever you cut with your scissors, you want to be very careful and press down firmly, but don't get too crazy with the scissors or else you'll cut crooked. There we go. And I'm just going to go and I'm going to cut all the way down. So if it's not perfectly straight, that's okay, but just try to get the best you can. The most important thing is to not cut into that seam right there. So if you had any loose threads on this edge, this will cut those loose threads off. So I've got that edge cut, and then you can just take this little excess that you cut off and just toss that in the trash. So we are now to this short edge, and remember when I sewed it, that one end ended up a little longer than the other. When we cut this, we're gonna fix that. So you're not even gonna tell that one end is longer than the other one. Oh. So just keep on cutting all the way down. And then something I like to do is right at the corner here, I'm gonna cut off a little bit. So not into the seams obviously, but I'm just gonna put my scissors right here, try and show you, and just cut off a little bit of that corner. Okay, so both of my seams are still intact, but I just cut off a little bit of the corner just to reduce the amount of fabric that is right there in the corner. So now that we have cut off the excess pieces of fabric here on our edges, we need to just iron the seams that we just made. So to do that, we're going to take our pillowcase and we're going to turn it wrong side out. Make sure that you get your fingers down in the corners and get all of that fabric pushed out. So the easiest way I think to do this is to kind of just slip the pillowcase onto the actual ironing board. So I'm going to adjust my camera yet again. There we go. So I'm going to take it, and you'll see that one side of your ironing board is bigger than the other, so the small end is kind of more pointed. And I'm going to slip my pillowcase onto my ironing board. And I want the long seam. The long seam is going to kind of be down the middle of my ironing board. So here's the seam I just made. And I'm just going to make sure that this seam is flat. So you do want to apply a little bit of pressure as you do this. You won't be able to get the very tip of the corner, and that's okay. So that was the long edge, and now I'm gonna move it a little bit to get the short edge. So here's that short seam we just made. And you want to be careful when you do this because you don't want to iron all these folds into your pillowcase. But you do want to make sure that this seam here is flat. So I'm going to take my pillowcase out. And now we have those two seams pressed to where they're nice and flat. In our last step, we ironed down these seams, but now we're going to pin them together. So our pillowcase is still turned wrong side out, and we're going to start here at the border fabric, specifically where the border and the main fabric kind of meet. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to pin these two sides of the pillowcase together, making sure that this seam is pulled flat. So we just ironed it flat. And the seam should be right here, right at the top. I'm going to put my fingers here and I'm going to place a pin. And basically what we're doing is making sure that our seam doesn't get rolled over on accident. And we're going to continue to do that all the way down the seam we just made. And all the way down the seams we just ironed. I'm going to adjust my camera so you can see a little better. You don't need a ton of pins because technically this pillowcase is all sewn together, but we're going to put a pin in every few inches or so to ensure that the fabric doesn't kind of roll on us. Again, you want to make sure that your pins are perpendicular to your edge. So the edge goes this way, the pins go this way. So we pinned the long edge, and if you hold it like this and you look from at the top, so as I'm looking right here, the seam should be right exactly at the top. And then we're going to go ahead and keep doing that with our short end. And we're almost to the end here. So we've got pins on our short end and on our long end. And if we hold our fabric like this and we look from the top, the seam should be right here at the top. So we are almost to the end of our pillowcase here. The last thing we need to do is to just sew on the edges that we pinned. So I'm gonna adjust my camera. I'm going to use a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Again, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm gonna start on my long edge as I have before. And I'm gonna start at the end with the border. I have already adjusted my blue masking tape to be where the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance is. I'm going to line my fabric up, the edge of my fabric up with the edge of my blue tape, lower my presser foot, lower my needle. I do want to make sure that I backstitch at the beginning and at the end. So I'm going to go forward, backstitch, and I'm just going to keep going on straight. Again, right here where my border fabric and my main fabric meet, there's a lot of layers of fabric right here. So you want to make sure that you have given your fabric just enough guidance that it needs to get through all those thick layers. So as you get to the end, of this edge here, there are two options for the corner part. You can either pivot at the corner, or you can just continue to sew a straight seam and backstitch here, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick up kind of the other end of my pillowcase that's fallen off and tugging. So I am going to backstitch here at this end. Backstitch, forward, backstitch to the end, or excuse me, stitch to the end and then back stitch again. Pull it out. Okay, so now I have my long edge sewn together, and I'm now going to do the shorter edge. Same as with the long edge, we are going to place the end of our fabric along the blue masking tape at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to lower my presser foot down, lower my needle, and I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end as I did before. So forward, back stitch, forward, making sure I take my pins out as I go. And you probably need to pick up your pillowcase and kind of move it over because it's going to want to tug. I'm going to put my fingers on each side of my presser foot here, back stitch, forward, and I get to the end, I'm going to back stitch a tad bit, and then forward, lift my presser foot. So now I have got my short end sewn together, as well as my long end sewn together. We are now on the final steps of our pillowcase. So we have just sewn the long and short edges, and we're going to trim any long threads that we have. So if you can see, there's some long threads here. I'm just going to cut those before I turn my pillowcase. They don't have to be right up to the very, very edge, but you do want to get rid of any really long threads like that. And this end. Okay, so we've cut those extra long threads, and now we're going to turn our pillowcase to where it is right side out. So when you turn it right side out, you should see that your border pieces match up, and you should make sure that all you see is a seam. You should not see any raw edges here. You should not have any extra long threads here. All you should see is a seam. I'm going to make sure and poke my fingers here into the corners and get any extra fabric out. So just shove my fingers here in the corner. And then we're just going to iron it real fast. So it doesn't need to be perfect, but it might be a little wrinkled since we had it wrong side out for a little while. And just for the sake of time and length on this video, I'm just going to iron one side, but whenever you guys iron it, make sure you iron both sides of your pillowcase. So here is our pillowcase. Again, you should see a perfect seam here on the outside, and when you tuck in on the inside, you should see a perfect seam as well. So you should not be able to see any raw edges. Let's test it out and see if it works. And here there is our pillow and our pillowcase.